Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Democracy That Delivers podcast. My name is Mardini Principe, and I am the program officer for our Levant programs on the Middle East and North Africa team at SIPE. Thank you for listening today, and we're delighted to have with us Dr. Patrick Mardini to talk a bit about the current situation in Lebanon. Patrick is the CEO of the Lebanese Institute for Market Studies, or LIMS, a think tank that SIPE has been proud to partner with for the last couple of years on the critical issue of currency stabilization in Lebanon. Multiple crises affecting Lebanon over the last several years has spurred an unprecedented economic collapse. The situation was made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2020 Beirut port explosion, and food insecurity due to the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia. With that, I'll turn it over to Patrick to introduce yourself and maybe tell the audience a bit more about LIMS and the latest on the economic situation in Lebanon.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. So, LIMS is a think tank operating in Lebanon, and we work on the economic challenges facing Lebanon. And today, Lebanon is facing a lot of economic challenges, as you might probably know. So it all started with the Lebanese government compounding a massive debt because of running a deficit year after year. The debt reached 170% of the GDP in 2019. That's one of the highest in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And the money came from the central bank, but the central bank did not print the money. The central bank borrowed depositors' money. So when the government finally decided to default on the debt, depositors lost their money because they thought they had their money at the bank or at the central bank, but in reality, the government had borrowed it and spent it. So we had a government debt crisis coupled with a banking crisis. We had those two happening at the same time. So the central bank stepped in by printing money to allow depositors to withdraw their money from banks. And printing money massively led to hyperinflation and devaluation. So instead of resolving the problem, it actually exaggerated the problem. The currency lost around 95% of its value. And so people became very poor, because if you are a Lebanese, a middle-class Lebanese who make 3 million Lebanese pound per month before the crisis, 3 million Lebanese pound, that's around $2,000, right? Today, the same 3 million Lebanese pound would make you less than $100. So people's income, salaries dropped from like $2,000 per month to less than $100 per month overnight, I would say. Yes, this was brutal, which made people very poor. And since the government defaulted on the payment of its debt and cannot borrow anymore, the government could not spend money on electricity, for example, on its government-owned electricity company. So we don't have electricity anymore. We have around 2 hours of electricity per day, thanks to some fuel bartered with Iraq. That's it. I mean, right? It's not functioning. The government telecom company, because the government also has a monopoly over telecommunication, also collapsed with the government default. Some government programs like subsidies, we were not able to finance them anymore. So we started having shortages of wheat, of bread, of medicine, of fuel, because those were subsidized items and the government could not afford paying the bill. So let's say everything collapsed at the same time, in addition to the hyperinflation, the devaluation, the debt crisis, the banking crisis. We had all those sectorial crises, and then the Beirut explosion came on top of everything. So it was like, very devastating, at least psychologically, for the population. Mm-hmm. And here we are. I would say Lebanon is still committed to an open economy. Lebanon would like to trade with the rest of the world and have access to markets, but the situation is getting harder and harder.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for that overall look at the situation right now. What are some of the steps that the government is taking to address this? Where's the hopefulness in the situation and resolving the crises?
Right. So the government tried many bad solutions first, right? They did all the errors they were not supposed to do. And now they finally came around and decided to work a serious reform program with the IMF. So the IMF is now Lebanon's only hope, because the Lebanese decision makers were not able to make the reforms on their own. So you need somebody to help them do that. And that's the only available option today in Lebanon. But before, getting to the IMF deal, They did many bad things. For example, for hyperinflation and the currency devaluation, what they did is they started blaming the private sector for it. So why is the Lebanese pound losing its value? Or because of those greedy money exchangers, they would not exchange the Lebanese pound at the official rate. They would exchange it at a devalued rate. So they started arresting money exchanger, and they did that. They arrested over 150 money exchanger over Lebanon, accusing them of being the reason behind the currency devaluation. In reality, they reflect the situation of the market, but they don't really do the devaluation themselves. Same thing when the prices started going up because of this hyperinflation, they started accusing the businesses, small shops owners, right? Oh yeah, those greedy businesses raising their prices, right? And they started cracking down on them and arresting them. And the Minister of Economy would come and take photos and bring the media when he is arresting or closing down shops, blaming them of being the reason of hyperinflation. So they tried to shift the blame because from the government perspective, they would like to keep on printing money. This is how they finance all their lavish expenditure and unnecessary expenditure which drove us actually at the first place into the current crisis we have. And they don't like to stop that. And now they are not unable to finance those expenditure through debt. So they would like to finance it through inflation, but they don't want to take the burden of inflation. They'd rather shift it to greedy businesses, right? So that's what they tried to do mainly, before shifting now toward an IMF deal.
And it sounds like with the currency devaluation, that is one of the most significant elements that has impacted the majority of the Lebanese population, and doing so in disproportionate ways. How have you and how has LIMS been addressing this issue?
Right. So I do agree that the devaluation and the currency crisis is the major issue now in Lebanon, and because it led to massive wealth disparity, right? And I do believe that this will be the challenge for Lebanon over the next decades. Even if we get a deal with the IMF, the wealth disparity will be a big, big problem. And it is mainly driven by the current hyperinflation. And the reason for that is simple, because it impacts the population through two axes, I would say. First, through their savings, right? The rich and powerful were allowed to transfer their money abroad at the official exchange rate during the crisis, right? So they have their money in dollars. They have their dollars, and they send their money abroad, while the rest of the population were under capital control at the same time. So you had capital control on some, but not on the rich and powerful, right? Who actually were allowed to get their money out. And so the rest of the population have their money under capital control, and it's losing its value day after day with the currency devaluation. So all the savings that those people have been trying to do over the years in order to protect themselves against any shock, any financial distress, well, now they are unable to use them. And the third axis is through income, right? Because in general, unqualified labor, poor people, I would say, they make their income in Lebanese pound. While, qualified labor, they are always able to work abroad, offer some services to external companies and make their income in US dollars. So those who are making their income in US dollar, can go by, and it would reduce the impact of the crisis on them. But the unqualified labor who is making their income in Lebanese pound, they are being massacred by the current currency crisis, especially the hyperinflation and the devaluation, which is still ongoing because the government is still running a fiscal deficit, financing them through inflation, and the central bank is still trying to cover banks' losses through printing also Lebanese pound. So, and those who are paying the price are actually the poorest among the Lebanese, and that's why poverty rate in Lebanon doubled over the past years, right? From around 30-40% to today around 80% of the population. We don't have middle class anymore. Everybody became poor, except for those specific people who have special treatment, who are allowed to get their money out, while the others were not allowed to.
And one of the things that LIMS has been pushing for, and we're a proud partner with LIMS on this, is currency stabilization through dollarization or the establishment of a currency board. What's the latest effort, or what's the latest on that effort?
Right.
And why is that the solution? Sorry, that piece to help people understand the currency board idea.
Sure. So the currency board is a solution that is fit for a country like Lebanon with very weak institutions, very high on corruption, and very unstable, right? Politically, socially, a lot of instability. In those kind of countries, currency board would be a good solution because you cannot trust decision makers with monetary policy. You cannot say, okay, I'm gonna, decision makers will become good overnight and we will hand them the power of conducting monetary policy, because unless we hope Lebanon would become, Switzerland or the US with strong governance. And since Lebanon is not heading to a better governance anytime soon, we thought that the best solution for Lebanon is to actually clone the US dollar through a currency board. So the currency board is a monetary arrangement that imposed very strong discipline on monetary authorities. The monetary authorities, the central bank, or it would become a currency board. The currency board won't be allowed to print money out of thin air. The only way to print money is to have reserves, US dollar reserve that would cover the currency at 100% rate. This situation would stop the government from printing more money that is not covered by actual dollars and would systematically stop hyperinflation and devaluation of the currency, which would actually stop the increasing poverty, right? Because, as I said, the main reason of poverty today in Lebanon is hyperinflation. The main reason of disparity is hyperinflation and currency devaluation. Once we do a currency board, we can stop that overnight. Now, the currency board won't resolve the financial crisis, the banking crisis. It won't resolve the government debt crisis. Of course, I mean, it's not like a magic pill, but it would stop hyperinflation, which is actually affecting the poor. So it will serve the poor. So we think that is the right solution for Lebanon in the current situation, to adopt a currency board. The problem is that the government would not want to do that, right? Because they would like to have the ability to keep on printing money indefinitely to finance their lavish expenditure. And when you tell them, you know what, we are going to impose more discipline, then they won't like it. So we tried to work on this in the past 2 years to promote this idea of having a currency board in Lebanon. And I think we managed to shift public opinion. At least we managed to convince the public, the media also, that devaluation is not due to money exchanger, and arresting money exchanger won't solve the devaluation problem. And hyperinflation is not due to greedy merchant. I mean, not all the merchants became greedy overnight. They were not greedy for the past 30 years, and overnight they all became greedy at the same time. It doesn't work like that. Inflation is also due to the central bank increasing money supply by tenfolds. Here in the West, in the US, if money supply increased by 5% or 10%, people would be scandaled, right? And people would say, oh my God, this will create inflation. When they increased money supply in Lebanon by tenfold, they multiplied. So that's like 1,000%. That's a lot. Okay. And which led to the massive devaluation, right? So basically, we managed to win this battle of why we have a currency crisis. It's not because of the private sector, it's because of printing money, right? And once we won this battle of idea, the systematic solution would become, well, you need to stop printing money, right? And how do you stop printing money? Through doing a currency board. So I think on this battle of ideas, we had the upper hand, especially on the inflation part of it. However, on actually implementing a currency board, it has been a very steep uphill. So what we did is we partnered with Professor Steve Henke of the Johns Hopkins University, who's the world leading reference on currency stabilization through currency board or dollarization. Professor Henke formed a working group at the Johns Hopkins University with some really top guns on the issue, and tried to help us with us. We delivered hundreds of interviews in the Lebanese media to raise awareness on the real reason behind inflation and how we can solve it. We also did many meetings with parliamentarian, one-to-one meeting, but also we had like a first meeting with a selected group of MPs where Professor Henke talked to them. Then we were invited by the economic committee at the parliament to give a testimony on the currency crisis and on the solution. So I was invited for one session, and then Professor Henke was invited for another session at the parliament. We did that, and we kind of had everybody on board. Professor Henke also talked with the governor of the central bank. We had some friends of LIMS who talked with different ministers and the prime minister, and the stars seemed to be aligned at a certain point. But then it all fell, or it all disintegrated when the IMF actually refused this reform and sabotaged our our effort to stabilize the currency. Unfortunately, right? It's not that they were against. At least their representatives in Lebanon, they actually actively campaigned against it. It's not like they so. Lebanese decision makers are convinced that a deal with the IMF is the only way out, which I do agree that a deal with the IMF is the only way out, because the international community won't support Lebanon if we don't have the stamp of the IMF, because the government is not credible anymore. And you need an international organization that would play an oversight on the actions of the government, which is a good thing to be done in the case of Lebanon. Now, historically, the IMF have supported currency boards in Bulgaria, in Estonia, in Bosnia, in many countries across the world. In the case of Lebanon, it felt they were against it, and that's where our efforts stopped. The IMF prefers a managed float system where the central bank would intervene on the market to stabilize the currency from time to time using the reserves, right? We have been experimenting with this system in Lebanon for the past year or 2 years, I would say now. And this system have been, I should confess, a real failure, because despite the managed float that we adopted, Lebanon is still losing foreign exchange reserve. Today, we are down to 10 billion. At the beginning of the crisis, we were around 35 billion. So we lost a lot of foreign exchange reserve through this stabilization mechanism that is not actually working. And despite losing those reserves, the currency is still losing its value. I mean, the Lebanese pound today is 40,000 Lebanese pound to the dollar. When we started discussing currency board, it was around 4,000 Lebanese pound to the dollar, right? So I mean, if we had done a currency board back then, we would have saved many people from poverty. And today we can still do it. I mean, right? Alternatively, we can wait until the Lebanese pound becomes 80,000 or 100,000 or 1 million, right? I mean, we don't know where it will end up. So yeah, that's where we are on the currency board, the reform specifically.
Well, certainly, it's complicated, and then, like you said, as soon as the IMF comes in and offers a plan that may provide some credibility for other international organizations to support and help, that naturally seems to be where a lot of the attention and focus goes. So certainly hope for the best in that regard.
Absolutely. I mean, the IMF has a whole package, and I do understand the logic behind the package of the IMF. From the IMF perspective, once you solve your debt problem, so your deficit problem, once the government starts spending less and improve tax collection on one hand, and once you solve the banking crisis, you do a haircut on, a bail-in, basically. That's what they are suggesting. So bank would default and depositors will lose their money. Then you don't have any reason to print money, because now you are printing money to finance government deficit and to finance those bank losses, right? So there won't be any reason to print excessive money. So the currency crisis would be solved. It will be the last step in the process of stabilization. And I do understand their logic, and their logic would be great if Lebanon has actually implemented those reforms 3 years ago, because it's been 3 years we're into the crisis. And things are very slow in Lebanon. You don't do reforms quickly in Lebanon, I mean, right? And meanwhile, since we did not stabilize the currency because we are waiting to solve those other problems first, people are very poor, and disparity increased and poverty increased. And, and many people are now struggling every day to meet their ends. And it's not something easy for the population to do. If we had stabilized the currency before those other reforms, we would not have solved all our problems, but we would have saved many people from poverty, from falling into poverty.
Well, turning maybe a bit towards a possible bright spot is the maritime border deal, which Secretary Blinken has hailed as a, quote, historic achievement that will advance security, stability, and prosperity for the region. Now, you mentioned before governance. Is Lebanon ready for this deal?
Well, the deal is very good for the area, for the region, for the Middle East. It's a great deal brokered by the U.S. administration. They did a great job. I mean, at a certain point of time, everybody thought that it won't happen, and it ended up happening. And kudos, right? That it was great. So the deal brings stability, brings safety in the sense that Lebanon traditionally has tensions on the southern border between Hezbollah and Israel. And those stabilities are now calmed, appeased a little bit because you have some common economic interests. So nobody has interest in fighting, right? So from a perspective of reducing security risk, it is very positive for Lebanon. It's also very positive for Israel because reducing security risk is important, but now Israel can export gas to Europe like immediately. So this is also financially very profitable for the Israeli side. Now, the problem with Lebanon is that politicians like to oversell things, right? They make a fuss out of things. So now politicians are pretending that Lebanon became an oil and gas exporting nation. It's not true. I mean, we are still searching for gas in the Mediterranean. We did not find on our part of the sea gas yet. So we cannot say that Lebanon is an oil exporting nation. That's not true, right? But I think that some politicians are looking for an achievement to sell to their public, and this would be one to sell. So that's the first point. But even if we assume that we actually found gas in the Mediterranean and we started the extraction process, it will take us many years before the money starts coming in. Let's assume that we found the gas, and let's assume that we did the extraction and the money started coming in. Where will the money go, right? In Lebanon, the banks deposited at the central bank at a certain point of time around today. I mean, the deposits of the banks at the central bank are around $70 billion. And this money vanished because of mismanagement, right? So this idea of the oil money would go to the population. No, I mean, we know that in Lebanon, money do not go to the population. It goes to some specific politicians, right, and some cronies and some businessmen who are very, who get into corrupt deals, and so that's a big problem. So we need to think. Again, if we find gas and if we are able to extract it in the right way, we need to find ways to get the money to the population directly and not going through the government, right? Or else we will do the same. The debate here is, would we first fix the Lebanese government and then, the problem will be solved? Or should we find a way that would allow the money to get into the population without going through the Lebanese government in order to avoid this corruption, right? So that's the real question that we are trying to figure out. And I do believe that there are ways that can allow Lebanon, the population of Lebanon, to profit from those oil and gas revenues if they happen, without going through the corrupt schemes of the government. I think that the government will fight back. The government would want to manage those resources because they would like to loot them the same way they looted other resources. So the question becomes, what is the best way to do governance? Should we give those resources to the government and then try to monitor the government? I think this way doesn't work. In Lebanon, I mean, in other countries it would work. In Lebanon, it would be very hard to work. Or another alternative governance scheme or system would be to actually avoid going through the government by paying the money directly to the population. And so you have an international company extracting gas and oil and selling it. Those revenues, I think, should not go to the government. They should go to every individual in Lebanon. And there are schemes that allow this thing to happen, and we are working on it currently.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Patrick. It's always a pleasure, and I always feel like I'm taking a class in monetary policy as well. So thank you for being here. Thank you all for listening to this podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon, Patrick.
Thank you, Mary, for this lovely podcast, and we will definitely see you again.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit sipe.org.